and the recording will be made available via our YouTube channel after the event. Also, every participant will receive a certificate of attendance. Please submit any questions you have in the chat box, and we will answer these at the end of the session. Without further delay, I'm happy to hand over to Bill, who's going to be talking to us about creating a solid base for assessment. Over to you, Bill. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Bonk. Let's see. Slides are not advancing. Charlie, help. The slides are not advancing.
Click on the third thumbnail of the slides, and then you should be able to move forward.
Sorry, say that again.
So if you move your cursor over the third thumbnail and click on the third thumbnail, and then after that, you should be able to use your arrow keys.
Got it. All right. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. So here's some housekeeping around the webinar. We're recording this, and you'll get a personalized certificate and a virtual goodie bag in 2 weeks. My official name is William Bonk. My go-to name is Bill, and I'm a director in Pearson, and I work on the creation of automated scoring for language tests. In particular, we work a lot on English testing, but we also test in other languages as well. I've been doing this for a while. So this is a topic that I think about a lot and I work on every day. It's so big that I think we could spend, an entire semester talking about some of these things. So I'm going to try to cover what I can and leave some time for questions and answers at the end. And this is my first time really presenting on this topic in this way. So I'm really happy to be talking about this. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I do this all the time every day, and we talk about it in our teams. And I'm sure that a lot of you are dealing with this topic a lot in your schools, in assessment contexts, et cetera. So let's come to a kind of common understanding about what the problems are and what some of the solutions are for working on rubrics. As I said, I've been doing this for a long time, and I think of rubrics not as something that is kind of like created and then stays around forever, but it's an exercise in continuous improvement. And I'd like to use a quote here, a slightly changed quote from a great educator named Dylan William. And I went to a talk in 2012 where he said, every teacher needs to improve, not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better. And this was given in the context of a talk around educator improvement and educator effectiveness. A lot of what has been going on here in the States has been creating metrics around the effectiveness of teachers and the value that they're adding. And there was a very strong backlash against this among the teacher and other school populations because they felt like it was punitive. They felt like they were being judged and punished when they were really trying to do their job and do it very well, because these measures were really kind of like comparing them to their peers and isolating and identifying the ones who were performing more poorly. And the purpose was not to shame those teachers that were performing less well or that were showing less high test scores from their students, et cetera. But the purpose was really just to say that we are all in this idea of continuous improvement, and rubrics are exactly the same thing. If I look at some of the rubrics that I wrote 20 years ago that I thought were absolutely fantastic, and I look at them now, I think, wow, I violated so many of the rules that now I think of as being really basic, good guidance and good principles for design. So it's something that we learn and we're constantly improving at. So I want to emphasize that all of these points that I'll be talking about today are just things that we should consider and things that we should look into as we're continuously improving the rubrics. Before we begin talking about the design principles or the kind of like best practices for writing and using rubrics, I'd like to just show some examples of rubrics. And I'll start with some very simple ones. Derwing and Monroe wrote an academic paper around accentedness, or the amount of accent that people had when speaking in a foreign language. They created this, what they called a scalar judgment of accentedness, where 1 was essentially no foreign accent, something kind of like what we might consider to be native-like, and a 9 was an extremely strong accent. So looking at this measure, or this very basic scale or rubric, you would notice a few things. One is that we only have the extremes anchored with some actual descriptors of performance. 1 is no accent, 9 is extremely strong. And again, these are somewhat subjective words. And then in between the 1 and the 9, it's left kind of up to the rater's discretion to identify what number that would be. So it's an interesting, this was a rubric that was used quite a bit over the years. So I wanted to show you a very simple and basic kind of rubric that also has particular features that you might not like. You might consider that different people would have different levels of what a 5 is, and that you could improve it by perhaps adding descriptors. And then when you add descriptors, you get into some of the problems that we'll talk about later. So Derwing and Monroe, to some extent, like went around the problem and just created a numerical scale, essentially with almost no descriptors, with just the extreme points, and allowed the raters to then kind of like freely determine their own levels. Another kind of rating scale that you might have seen is what has been called Likert scales or Likert scales. It's typically a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. You find this often very frequently used in survey research. So the top line, strongly disagree, disagree, undecided, agree, and strongly agree, are the kinds of descriptors that people can very quickly use. They kind of like form a snap judgment, and just like, querying their own mind about it. And they can quickly just internalize this 1 to 5 scale, especially because it gets repeated from item to item to item. So they can use it over and over again. It's very fast and easy to use. And it creates what's ostensibly the same scale for every item. So that's a feature, and it's also maybe a challenge for some kinds of items. And you can see that Likert scales can be used with many other kinds of descriptors that have to do with the frequency of things like never to always, the quality or evaluation of things like very poor to excellent, the frequency with which we observe things, almost never true or almost always true, or about our feelings or our emotions, our perceptions of things, and then also just things that, more generally that go from negative to positive. You'll notice that I've arranged them all so that lower numbers typically are like things that are less frequent or lower quality or more disagreement, and the upper ones are always higher. But sometimes people veer away from that norm sometimes. You can imagine that Likert scales have some very good qualities and also some poor ones, because they may not be a very good fit for the kinds of things that we're trying to judge in some cases. Here's another one that I grabbed from a book that I'll show you the reference for later. And this is used in a classroom for a poster. Presumably this was probably something that was done with some older kids, or probably I'm thinking maybe in secondary school. And this was a group assignment where they made a poster about the Battle of Normandy in World War II. And you can see that it has 4 levels: excellent, good, fair, and weak. And then each of those levels has a few descriptors. Each of the levels has several descriptors, but not a lot. And you can, if you look at the actual pieces of them, they are talking about neatness, misspelling and appropriateness of the content, organization, understandability, accurately reflects the chosen perspective, and teamwork is obvious, okay? And also there's this other thing about how easily it can be read. So even though this is only, 2 sentences in that top descriptor, it actually has like 8 different kinds of criteria here. And then some of the criteria are apparent in lower levels, and some of them kind of disappear. So typically people will begin with what they think to be like the mastery or the best level, and then they work their way downward. And in some cases, some of those rating criteria are no longer relevant, or maybe people just forget about them and don't find that they're discriminating between those levels anymore. Notice that the bottom descriptor is much shorter and only has a few different criteria. A more complicated one, this is a seminar, what I found as it was a kind of like a group discussion and seminar after doing some extensive reading. This says that it was used for grades 5 through 12. And I've only copied the top 2 levels, but actually it went down to 1 as well. So the top one was called perceptive, that's a 4. And you can see it's got a large number of sentences, many different dimensions, many kinds of behaviors. And according to the book, this was used for grades 5 through 12. So from 10-year-olds all the way up to 18-year-olds doing this kind of similar task. So extremely complex. And you can imagine as a rater what you would be doing as you were listening to a performance of people, that if this was an assessment opportunity, and to kind of like keep track of all these things, you probably would have a copy of the rubric there for every performance, and you would be sitting there circling things that you're observing, Xing out things that you're not observing, scratching out things that don't seem applicable. So you're kind of like doing this complex task of sorting through these many, many details that are in the performance level descriptors, and trying to come up with a final score. So a very complex cognitive and behavioral task is being asked of these raters. Here's another one that's, again, quite complex. This one is focused on writing, and we have high, average, and low levels here. I didn't copy the low over. And as you can see, there are many bullet points here that use different descriptors. It's a little bit easier than the previous one because they're separated by bullets and they're not written in full sentences. So it's a little bit easier to interrogate as a rater, but again, quite complex. It uses many different kinds of dimensions, and we'll come back to what maybe some of the problems of this sort of approach might be. So I've shown like 5 examples of different kinds of rubrics that are all frequently used, and all of these potentially could have some improvements or some, we might find some great points on them. Let's kind of go to the basics though, like what is a rubric? And we use, in the States, we use the word rubric. I know that the word rubric can also be used in other countries in different ways, or we might call it a scoring rubric to be more clear. But for me, a scoring rubric is this written set of criteria that define the qualities or the quality of a performance or a body of work. So it's written, it's criteria, and it defines certain characteristics or qualities. And I wrote or quality because it could be an evaluation where you're saying whether something is good or good enough or excellent or poor. And it's based on a performance or a body of work. So it could be like a single session, you know, a 15-minute observation, or it could be an observation that's done over many occasions or a whole portfolio of work. The second point here of the definition is that it's used to provide data. And those data will feed into another process, which might be an evaluation, an opportunity for feedback to a student or to teachers or to parents or to many other stakeholders. It could also be provided, this data for for a decision. So we might have a 15-minute interview. In my case, we often are like using language proficiency to determine whether someone is suitable for a promotion in a job or whether they are adequately proficient in English to sit in a customer service chair and answer calls from people who are speaking in that language. So it's a decision. It's like a yes or a no. And often in those cases, the scoring criteria are not shared with the people who are taking the test, and their scores are not even really shared in any detailed way. It's really just, here was your score, you needed a 64, you got a 58, so you were not hired for this. So the rubric is one piece, then there's the data, and the rubric itself is consulted by or read by these key stakeholders. These are your raters often, who are trained for the task, but essentially they are not robots. They are not being trained to do things in a way that's just moving in a very lockstep fashion. We're using humans because we want their intelligence and their contextual knowledge about this situation to help us make judgments about people or make an evaluative decision or provide some feedback. And so we're using them because they know something and because they're intelligent humans. And then finally, often we typically are using a rubric because we want to convert qualitative judgments from these intelligent stakeholders into quantitative measures, into numbers. But notice that that's the last step. The numbers are not there from the beginning. They don't have to be there. And often what we really want raters to do is interact with the qualities of what they're seeing rather than something that's converted to a set of artificial numbers. If we're researchers or we're testers, we're going to then deal with the numbers ourselves once we get into a larger piece of data. When do we use rubrics? When I was growing up, we didn't use rubrics. When I wrote an essay in my school, often what I would get back is a lot of proofreading marks in red, or sometimes they didn't use red, but they would write proofreading marks, they would write comments and questions, and often there would be a kind of like summative judgment at the end where they would say, nice paper, I don't think you developed your ideas well enough, I liked some of the innovative things that you wrote, B-. So you get a grade. And again, this was before the era when rubrics were commonly used. So I came to them only once I became a teacher. And we're using them because it's a very good idea. That kind of feedback often was not very useful for me as a learner, and it seemed kind of arbitrary and sometimes unfair. So we use rubrics in somewhat open-ended tasks. Obviously, we're not going to use a rubric for something like a multiple choice test or something. And we can use it in many, many situations: classroom assignments, portfolios, an actual assessment or a test, research where we're not actually giving scores to people, but we're trying to figure something out. We're trying to identify what are the relevant and irrelevant traits. For example, if we're looking at people in customer service encounters in English, we might have a large set of things that we're going to investigate, and we're going to investigate all 30 of them and then figure out which ones actually fit, which ones are relevant to the customer service context, and which ones maybe are not so relevant or are not important or don't fit together with the others. Program evaluation is often used when we're trying to figure out whether if our learning system is working for our learners, if students are actually learning what we're trying to teach them, or if the teachers feel like their efforts are not being well served. Rubrics can also simply be used to provide feedback back to learners and guidance for learners. So I have a student, or I have a kid who's in 5th grade, so he just turned 11 years old, and his teachers regularly give them rubrics for their classroom assignments in order to give them guidance to know what to include when you do a presentation. What are the pieces that you should have, and what should they look like? So it takes a lot of time up front to create these rubrics, but it's extremely useful guidance for learners to know what to include when they're doing something, when they're actually spending all their time. And finally, we use this for training for automated scoring systems, which I'll talk about at the end here. Why do we use rubrics? Well, we use them to specify the quality criteria for us as testers or teachers, for learners, and for other people, parents, other stakeholders. We want to ensure consistency of marking. As I mentioned, with those teacher marks that I got on my essays when I was in high school, it was not clear to me what the criteria were sometimes. So this way, the criteria are very clear. They've already been written down. And this way, it stays consistent. And teachers are looking for the same thing over and over again. It's a way of making sure that that B- that I got on my essay is communicated effectively, and I can see what are the pieces that created that B-, rather than just a teacher's feeling of I'll give it a B-. That doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in your teacher or in the grading system or in its fairness. Typically, we're also very interested in measuring things in the same way over time, over many years. We want to make sure that we're doing things across different teachers and different programs in the same way. As researchers, we're often very interested in separating out dimensions of performance that can then acquire better psychometric properties as we revise them more and more. So as I mentioned earlier, we might start with 30 possible dimensions of performance for customer service, and then later on we analyze them and we figure out number 1, number 8, number 13, number 20 are all measuring the same thing. Number 39 is measuring something very different and not relevant, and so we're going to squeeze that down to a more manageable set of dimensions by using data. And finally, we often use these rubrics to validate externally conceived standards of performance, often from some higher level people at government or in a corporation or in a school system or any like higher level stakeholders, they're going to like tell us what the standards are. And so we often need to validate them by looking into particular aspects of those. So we'll include those standards in our rubrics and then show them where it actually works or where it doesn't work to validate those standards. Some of the more basic decisions that we really need to make about rubrics are what they will be used for. Like, are we making decisions, inferences, grades, etc.? Think about these things as you're designing them. Who will assign the ratings? Are they externally hired stakeholders? Are they other teachers? Is it just you and your fellow researchers? And under what conditions? The amount of time that you're giving people, the kind of situation that they're in might determine the fact that you need to have a simpler rubric because you're asking them to do more complex things. When I was working in Japan, we used to do a group oral conversation test where we had 4 students sitting together in a group, and for about 10 minutes they would discuss a single topic, and we would have 2 raters there listening to them and assigning scores on 5 different criteria: pronunciation, fluency, communicative effectiveness, language use, and vocabulary. And so we've got 5 things, 4 different people, and we're doing that all in 10 minutes. So it's an extremely tiring and complex task. And if you don't see some of those things, you might not be able to provide a score. So in that case, we probably went a little bit too far and tried to ask people to do too much. We use those kinds of 5 separate criteria in an analytic way. That's an analytic rubric where you're separating things out. A holistic rubric says, we're not going to try to separate this out. We don't need to. It's too complex. Let's put it all into a kind of holistic judgment of just quality or some very basic performance level descriptors. And it's not very specific. It's not general. It's much more general. We'll also need to think about who sets the criteria and later revises them. And those are the things that are in the rubrics. How many of those traits to include is a very important thing because we don't want to have too many and we don't want to have too few. We want to have adequate coverage for the kind of decision we're trying to make. Another decision we need to make about rubrics is whether we're going to make them task specific. So that Battle of Normandy one mentioned the Battle of Normandy, but it was actually a very general rubric around doing a poster and what are the things that we would expect to see in a good poster versus a poor one. You can make very task-specific rubrics, which are going to be more reliable and easier to use for your raters. But the trade-off is that they are more expensive because they require more rater training. Every time there's a different task, you have to have a new rubric that mentions the specific characteristics of those performances. And it takes more training and it takes more time to do. And also the general ones are nice because once people, if you have a general rubric that you can apply to many different tasks, that gives you a way of generalizing across tasks. And task-specific rubrics provide, let's say a 0 to 5 score on that task, but a 4 on that does not necessarily translate to a 4 on another different task with a task-specific rubric. So you need to consider these things in your situation. And the final thing is related to the numbers that I talked about. So you as a researcher or a teacher are going to convert these ratings into the next step, which is marks or grades or scores or feedback. And you need to consider how you're going to do that. Often you can't pre-engineer that. You have to think about it after you've collected some data. So raters really are one very important aspect of a kind of assessment situation where we have the test takers, we have the items or the content of the assessment, we have the rubric that we've already talked about that you've pre-designed, and then you have the raters that are going to interpret that rubric in the light of the performances that they see. So all 4 pieces need to work together effectively for a good assessment system. So in some cases, you have to trust your raters and use them as for their greatest benefit. And in some cases, you can't trust them, or you can't trust everything that they're doing to be appropriate. So your purpose is to use them and their human intelligence to help you create these ratings that will then eventually become something else. Raters really like clarity. They like clear instructions, clear examples, clearly written rubrics. They don't like having to make difficult decisions. They don't want gray areas where you're asking them, well, choose between these and just use your best judgment. They want really clear criteria. So if you can write it in that direction, that will make it faster and easier and less frustrating for them. Now, one process that we know happens is that rubrics are typically not very consistently and very specifically consulted by raters as they're doing rating tasks. You give them a rating set of rubric, a scoring rubric, they look at it, they internalize it, they begin to bring it into their brain, into some kind of categories, and then they use that internal representation of the rubric to create their ratings. They are, unless you have particularly meticulous raters, you will find that this is what people do, even when you tell them not to. It's just a fact of life. So you have to accept that. And so you use the idea that you're going to simplify your rubric and make it easy for them to internalize it, to bring it into their brain, and then they're going to use that representation of the rubric to begin with an impression. They'll hear someone talking. They'll immediately have an emotional reaction. They'll form an emotional and specific reaction about that person's accent, about the way they speak, about the content of what they're saying. Within 3 seconds, they've formed an impression. That's called anchoring. And then they're going to adjust from there. So they'll think, oh, this person kind of sounds like a 2 on the pronunciation. Oh, but now I heard he pronounced some other words better, so I'm going to move it up to a 3. That's typically the process that people go through when they're using a rubric. So you have to kind of live with that reality and write the performance level descriptors as best you can to incorporate that process. Now, again, raters are a very valuable resource for you because they're showing you, as one of those important facets of your assessment system, they're showing you the problems. If they're having trouble, it's because you didn't write the rubric right to accurately capture things that are easily observable in the performances or easily decidable between the different levels. They're going to help you describe these problems by identifying them for you. So use that. Don't blame them for it, but their tasks should be easy. If you haven't made it easy, you need to do more work on your rubric, more work on your items, and more work on perhaps preparation of the for the test takers to take the assessment and know what to expect. And finally, raters, we're using their intelligence, we're using their judgment, we love them. They often make mistakes and they're not necessarily the gold standard. What I typically do in my situations when I'm guiding raters is I don't say, if we have 2 raters that disagree on one performance, we're going to have a 3rd rater be the adjudicator or the gold standard or the judge, and find that that person is the best rater, and so that person is going to make the final judgment. Typically, I don't like to do that because I think there is a lot of research evidence that those gold standard raters are actually not more reliable or not better than all the rest of the group of raters. So there's some kind of knowledge, there's some wisdom in the numbers, in the large number of people that can be crowdsourced and used, and that averaging actually creates a much better rating than using a particular rater that you think is a gold standard. And again, gold raters often make mistakes. Individual raters make many mistakes. So we shouldn't necessarily trust that just the particular ratings that we're seeing are the truth. They're kind of like what we're seeing as that sample of the truth that we can create. Again, we want to make it very easy for the raters to do their tasks. So we want to give them a manageable task given the time of the performance. We want to make it quite simple for them. So don't let them deal with numbers. They shouldn't have to be adding things together, counting things. That's not their job as a rater. They should be doing things that are very easy and snap judgments for them. They should be able to immediately latch onto the performance level descriptor that you've given them that makes the most sense for this performance. So you're helping them to make these decisions easily by writing the descriptors well and by focusing on pointing them to the things that are observable, that they can really see, and not asking them to imagine what the candidate would do in another situation, what they really know, what the size of the vocabulary is. We don't want them to make inferences. We want them to focus on observable things. And the fact that things are observable sometimes can go kind of like too far in that direction. People in writing, for example, are often very susceptible to a bias against spelling errors or grammar errors or particular aspects of the performance that make them adjust downward. They anchor here and then they see, oh, spelling error, down. Oh, grammar error, down. Oh, very basic grammar error, down, down, down. And we want to like know that dynamic and discourage them from doing that. We want to point them onto the particular features that are the salient and important ones and focus them off of things that are irrelevant. In some cases, maybe you don't think spelling is relevant. Spelling, we really shouldn't be using raters to judge spelling because there are other ways of judging that more accurately. Here's some more information about how to make it easy for raters. We want to use language that's appropriate for their role. So maybe you have a degree in applied linguistics and you know a lot of the jargon of linguistics, but that shouldn't be in the rubrics if you intend people who are not specialists to be reading them and using them. In fact, if you're giving the rubrics to students, it should be written in a very simple and easy to read way so that they can understand it. You might create two different versions of the rubric. You might have the one that the raters use, which is a little more technical and specific, and then one that students can use, which has less jargon. But make sure that you're using language that is easily interpretable for people at their level of understanding for the purpose that they're using them for. Avoid rules of thumb when you're writing these rubrics. Like one that we've used in the past, which I recently eliminated, was when in doubt, give the lower category. If somebody is constantly like lowering things because they're in doubt, you're forcing the scores downward. What we like from the large number of ratings that we can get is that variation. So if you know some of these performances are really a continuum, and a 2.5 might actually be the real score for somebody when the only thing that raters can choose is either a 2 or a 3. So if we get some people choosing 3 and some people choosing 2, we end up with the correct answer of a 2.5. But if you're always asking people to give the lower category, you're forcing them to give categorical scores that they don't really believe in. So allow them the ability to disagree, and then in the mathematics of judging analyzing the ratings, you're going to use that variation and use it to your advantage to create a score of 2.5, even though the raters couldn't select it. In some cases, in the same way, you want to give people the ability to give a 0.5 or to admit some cases, I can't score this. I don't know how to score this. I'm not going to be forced to give them a 2. I'm going to say, I can't decide. And let's let other people decide if they have a stronger opinion about it. In my judgment, often we're using analytic ratings because analytic scoring rubrics because they are more valuable for us. So they focus raters on one trait at a time instead of having them try to figure out pronunciation, fluency, communicative effectiveness all at the same time. For different people, we often want to give them maybe just one of those categories and focus on it. And this is to help them avoid the halo effect. Sometimes people will see, he's kind of a 2 on this. Maybe he seems like a 2 on this. Often people will give 2s across the board, which when we really would like them to separate those dimensions and give a 3 and a 1 and a 0 to the same person on different dimensions. That's why we have different dimensions. Otherwise, we would be using the same rubric for everything, just the same holistic rubric. And often the rubric itself should be quite simple in language. So we often will take examples, anchor performances, and high-level things to focus on and take them out of the rubric and put them in the training so that the rubric is simple. It's one page right next to them. As they're looking at the performance or listening to it, they're looking at a very simple thing, and they've internalized some of the other things, which are anchors, like this is a real level 2 performance, this is a real level 4, okay, or examples of things that people might say or do, or high-level things to focus on, like we might give them many descriptors in a rubric, but we're going to say, really focus on the person's fluency. We want to focus on the flow of their language, how much hesitation they're doing. And that's kind of like, almost like putting a holistic judgment on top of an analytic rubric, which can be useful for helping anchor your raters on the appropriate stuff and guiding them away from things that are inappropriate to be thinking about. So generally in rubrics, we're thinking shorter is better. Often people write very long rubrics. We want them to be shorter, less than 1 page. Separating things, as I said, analytically is usually better. Just like when you squeeze all of the toothpaste out of the tube, it's difficult to get it back in. So if you start with an analytic set of rubrics, you can always squeeze them together if you find that these traits hang together in terms of the data. But if you start with them all smashed together, you don't know what a 2 really is, because you don't know what the raters were using as the criteria to create that 2, especially when you have many different kinds of traits all in the same rubric, all pointing towards a 2. Usually, I'm trying to get people to get fewer categories rather than 10, 12, 40, right? You're not going to be very reliable at those longer levels. So really getting it down to like 5, 4, even in some cases, the data only will support 2 or 3 categories of performance. So don't be afraid to get it down. You can always squeeze it out further, but I would be not be afraid to make the task easier for raters and making your data more reliable initially by using a smaller number of categories. How do you come up with these categories? Often you use your data. You have a large bunch of performances that you're going to look at as a group of people, and you're going to be looking for the characteristics of low and medium and high level performances, and using those data in there to then write the rubric, test it out, revise it, test it out again, revise it again, test it again. It's a little bit of a continuous improvement process every time. And so that's how we would use the data to prepare this. Some real no-nos in writing the rubrics that I've come up with over the years are, first of all, many times people have too many words. As I said, like raters often want to internalize the rubric, so they're not paying attention to all those words. The more words you put in, the fewer words they will pay attention to. So keep it as simple as possible. Try not to mash together different kinds of criteria artificially. So if you put in neatness, coherence, vocabulary, grammar, usage of idioms, usage of writing conventions, when you put all of these things together, it's very difficult to separate them out again, and it's very difficult for raters to use. So separating things out, even though it adds more rating occasions, might be a better solution in most cases. I would avoid vague language. Really be very, very wary of using terms like precise vocabulary or good language use that sound good, but are very subjective, and different people will have different ideas about this. So you probably have to have definitions of these, but if you have like a half a page definition of precise vocabulary, you've already lost the battle. Those raters will not pay attention to it. So be very wary of vague language and try to write things that are really specific and observable in the performance. I would also be careful of the first thing I showed you, of those score levels without descriptors. The 1 to 9 scale of accentedness with no descriptors from 2 to 8. That's very, very subjective and difficult for raters to use. Another thing to avoid is just using these kind of simple adverb changes to change the levels. Like often we'll start with one level and then we'll say, oh, this is a good set of descriptors at level 3. And then we'll just like say, usually does these things, always does these things, sometimes does these things. That's really a cheap way of describing performance, and it's a very bad way of constructing a rubric. You really need to look more closely at the data and not just use these kind of adverb changes to make it levels. I would avoid wishy-washy language. I call it like, wishy-washy when people say things like might show this, can do this, may do this. Those are useless as descriptors. Either they do it or they don't, or they do it always, or they do it sometimes, but don't just say may. That's not really helpful to raters. So these are kind of like often trying to be descriptors, or trying to like being extra information for raters to use, but they don't use it. It just confuses them. I would avoid that if you can. There's often a case where we say, okay, I want to have a total of 25 points for people's performance. So I'm going to have a 5-point rubric for communicative effectiveness, a 5-point for pronunciation, a 5-point for fluency, blah, blah, blah. I'll add that up and I have 5 rubrics, 5 points each, 25 points, I'm done. Well, that's a bad decision to start with. You really should not be locked into the idea that each of these traits is going to have 5 levels. Some of them may not. Some of them may only show 3 levels, and some may show more. So don't start with that kind of assumption. Start with the data. Start with looking at what are the levels that you can see there and determine. And so maybe you're not going to, you can adjust it mathematically later, but you might not have 5 levels of 5 traits perfectly sequenced every time. It's just like a bad way to start. And the final thing I would say is keeping your rubrics secret is a bad idea. Rubrics want to be free. Learners should be looking at them as they're planning for the assignment or for the assessment or for the test or for the performance that they're going to give. Stakeholders should be able to look at them and know what a level 4 has been decided by the raters. So these numbers have no meaning to people when they haven't been involved in your test, when they're not a researcher or not an applied linguistics a person reading your paper. So you need to tie that performance to something that they can think of in reality, and the rubric is the key. So as much as possible, you should be able to release your rubrics to the public and show them to everyone that's involved so that everyone knows what these scores actually mean. It's really valuable as feedback and as formative assessment practice for teachers and students to do this. And it's very important for downstream, the final stakeholders of people that want to know how to use the scores that you've constructed. Let's see, I'm just about out of time here, so I'm gonna skip over the part of talking about automated scoring, and I'm gonna go straight to some question and answer part. Before I do that, I want to make sure that you understand that you see this book. I think it's a fantastic book about how to make and recognize good quality rubrics by Arter and Chapuis from 2006. It's available from Pearson. And I'm not advertising it because it's Pearson, but because I think it's a great book and it's really valuable to have. And for now, I'll take some questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bill. That was a great session. Always brilliant to see you talking about assessment in this way. So thank you. We have had a couple of questions come through. So I'll read them out to you, and let's see if you can give some answers, shall we? So what's the best number of criterias for rubrics?
Oh, I'm sorry, say that again.
What's the best number of criterias to include in rubrics? Or is there not a best number, perhaps?
So the criteria, I think we're talking about dimensions of performance. So, for example, in the group speaking situation that I was talking about, where we used fluency, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and communicative effectiveness, those seem to be all the dimensions that we agreed on as a group, as stakeholders. That would be all the things that we would like to know about students and like to know if they're making progress. Now, that's a lot for a 10-minute group performance. So, but it's more about the coverage. So we felt that those 5 covered everything. Possibly you could fold pronunciation and fluency together into some kind of like oral language use. And then you could like have only 4. So there is no real number. It depends on how much time you have to do an assessment and how many criteria are valued by the stakeholders in your situation. And then if we're talking about the number of criteria, the number of scale points within one dimension, like if we're talking only about communicative effectiveness, I would say probably once you're at 7, it's almost impossible for raters to agree. So 7 levels of score is probably the maximum that people can do, even at with a lot of training and with a very extensive performance. Often when we're measuring performance of kids, we're looking only at kind of 3 levels. So basically, something like a 0 score or the lowest obtainable score, something that's kind of in the middle, and something that's higher. So there's no real rule of thumb here. I would say you would use your data, and you would use the coverage, and you would use the situation in terms of the amount of performance that people have to help you decide that.
Great, thank you so much. While you answer the next question, could we actually go back to a slide where you've recommended the book title? And we could leave that up. Great, thanks very much. Okay, so the next question, do you have any recommended tools or apps to create rubrics or guidelines? Does Pearson provide any guidelines, for example?
I don't have any that I know of. I think this is something that is, again, like it's a process that you engage in within your institution and within the kinds of decisions that need to be made about people. I would say fresh air is good. Getting more people to look at it, getting more stakeholders, and not keeping things secret, but having other people react to it, give their impression of it. And especially you're getting a lot of information from raters about how well they're doing it and how easy it is to use. So I don't have any apps or tools to suggest to you. I've kind of thought about creating something like that myself, but it's a pretty complex process.
Sure, I can imagine. Well, let's get people's thoughts on Bill creating a process here. So
just write me an email and I'll help you with it. Yeah, I'll help everyone.
Brilliant. Okay. Were there any slides in your presentation that showed an example of a rubric that we could also show up? Or was that not included? I don't recall. There we go. Brilliant. Thank you. So,
well, I had a few. This is one that I've recently developed. This is one where we had a more complex rubric originally, and I tried to separate it into two different dimensions because I felt like people were squeezing together the content with the language use. So I kind of was working on this as a draft, and in listening to a lot of the data from kids responding to these oral tasks, they were essentially like listening to a story and then asked to tell it back in their own words. I came up with these general rubrics. One is around content and one is separating out the language use. And these are not completely separable dimensions. So if somebody only says 5 or 6 words, clearly they're going to get a 0 on both because they just don't have enough topic response there to get a higher score on the content. And we don't have anything near the amount of data to judge their language use with only 5 words. So they're not fully separable dimensions. They are very highly correlated, but I wanted people to be able to especially get a high score on content with a low score on language use, where people can really do their best to reproduce the story, but maybe they do it in a way where their language is quite limited. They don't have much grammar or vocabulary and they're struggling to do it. Or on the other hand, you've got people that can speak almost like bilingually, their accent is perfect. They sound, their delivery is perfect, but they don't actually pay attention to the story and reproduce it in an accurate way. So I try to separate these things out. And so this is an example of a very, a simple rubric. I think the language use is probably, I could squeeze out a lot of the language here and still make it usable.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then sort of continuing on from that, do you make rubrics where different segments carry different points based on how important a segment is, or are they equally important?
I think, yeah, that's a great question. You should never assume that they're equally important. You can always adjust that afterwards. So the point of creating, of having raters use your rubric is to figure out in what, like the ratings, especially if you're using analytic rubrics, you've got a separate rating here for content and then a separate one for language use. You can adjust it mathematically afterwards. You can even put it into what we would call a rash model, and you can adjust for the different severity and leniency of raters, and you can accurately weight these things based on the data that you have. So I would not predetermine what those weights should be, and certainly I wouldn't give that task to the raters. The raters should just be rating. Turning it into numbers is your job. So that should be a separate task. And you can always manipulate these ratings numerically in order to arrive at the weight that you want.
Nice one. And then we have one question from Erica, but before we move on from rubrics, somebody's asked about using the same rubric they use in the classroom online. can you use the same rubric that you used in the classroom online? Or perhaps, can you see any limitations of why you couldn't, Bill?
Let me think about that. So, meaning because we're now like in an online environment.
Exactly. So it's a different sort of setup, and you haven't got that face-to-face element.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the situation. There are probably cases in which you can reuse the rubric. Certainly on written tasks, that would be very easy to do. In terms of maybe this questioner is thinking more about like interaction, where we're no longer face-to-face interacting, but we're interacting virtually. I would say you may consider that you would probably look into the data and try to figure out if some of the dimensions of performance that you originally identified are no longer relevant. And if there are other performance dimensions that are newly relevant because it's an online environment. So I would say let the data help you along there and help you decide.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm going to squeeze in two more, Bill. One of them will be a shorter answer, but this is quite a nice one that's come in. You said we should avoid using sort of cheap adverbs to change the level, but could you explain in a bit more detail how we can determine descriptors for scoring within a criterion, and what would you recommend we did instead of using these sort of cheap adverbs?
So I would say the reason we use those cheap adverbs, and I've done it myself a million times, so guilty. The reason we do that is because we try to have a set of criteria in one performance level descriptor, and then we try to mirror that same kinds of trait or observation in other levels. So often we will say, we'll see something in one level and we say, oh, we need to measure that at all these levels. And so our way of doing that is often to then not use the data to guide us, but just to kind of like imagine, okay, well, they use the correct words most of the time here. So then at the next level, it has to be all the time. And then a level below that, it has to be some of the time. And I would encourage you to just really look in your data. And in some cases, you'll find that something like a particular criterion is only relevant at the top 3 levels. Let's say we have a 0 to 5 scale, and it's a writing scale. So we're looking at people writing essays. At the upper level is where some of these traits might come in around coherence, around like making the argument in a way that feels logical to us as readers. And they lead us along, they take us by the hand and show us, here's an example of what I'm talking about. Here's my next point, right? That kind of coherence is a higher level feature that may be completely absent from level 0, 1, and 2. So you don't have to include that at the level 0, 1, and 2. Don't feel that every one of these things must be represented at every score level. Use the data that you see in all of these observations as your team are looking through the performances to think about what you should put into the rubric, to think about what belongs at what levels and what doesn't. In some cases, you might feel that some of these traits are only applicable at the lower levels and some are applicable at the higher level. It looks messier. It's not neat and mirrored and perfectly articulated from 0 to 5, but that's the way the performance is. That's the way the world is. So you have to adhere to that and give up that level of control and neatness. That would be my advice about that. So I would say, try not to use that as a general strategy to developing your rubrics, is that kind of adverb thing. Try to just look at what you see in the data that discriminates among a few levels. And you don't have to have 5 levels. It might be only 3. And then you might, with more experience, see that there are actually 4 levels here. Sometimes the data from a rash model will even show you that there are 4 levels here, and you can try to squeeze another level in there by figuring out what the discriminating criteria are.
That's great, Bill. Thank you. And it pains me to say that we've run out of time, but we've had so many good questions coming in. I think what we're going to have to do is type these up. And for all of those unanswered questions, we're going to send out an email response to you all, and we'll find the answers to what you've asked. There was one very short one here. We've got somebody who'd be keen, I think, would be keen to become a rater. How can somebody approach that? Is there a sign up form, or do they contact a local rep perhaps, or what would be the recommended route if somebody wanted to get involved and be a rater?
I guess they could contact me. You can find my email address there, and we often hire raters, and all the raters are working at a distance right now. So we love to have people that come from a great diversity of backgrounds, because again, we use that as a part of the group intelligence to help us do better measurement. So sending the email with your interest, and we could consider you for a future project.
Right on. Okay. So of course, Erica, I'm going to send you some details. I mean, we've got people asking for your email address here. Bill, do you mind if I put it in the chat box?
No, no worries.
Great. Okay. William Bonk at Pearson.com. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Great. Nice one. There you go, guys. So there's Bill's email address. Please get in touch with him if you've got some questions about becoming a rater. I'm also now copying in the URL to the schedule for the rest of the webinar series. So perhaps you can find the answer to some of your questions in a future webinar. We've got another 2 days of webinars, and the recordings for last week's webinars will be uploaded to our YouTube channel as soon as we can manage to do that. So Bill, thank you so much for putting together those slides and for your time presenting today.
Thank you, Charlie, and thanks everyone for joining. And I wish I were traveling now, and I miss seeing all of you out in the rest of the world outside of my office. So I hope we all get through this time safely. Thanks for joining.
As do we. Thanks everyone for taking out the time in your day to join us. Just to mention again, certificates are being sent out. The recording will be uploaded, excuse me, to our YouTube channel, and a virtual goodie bag will be sent to all of you with a plethora of useful and interesting links. We hope to see you at another Pearson English webinar very soon. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.